What would you do if the person you trusted most in the world was secretly trying to destroy everything you loved? I need you to really think about this for a moment. Have you ever helped someone who was down on their luck? Maybe you've given money to someone on the street, or let a friend crash at your place during tough times. Have you ever fallen for someone who was already taken, someone whose heart was divided between you and someone else? And have you ever felt that burning, consuming sensation when you think someone close to you has betrayed you? If you've experienced any of these situations, then you understand the individual ingredients that, when combined, can create the perfect storm of human emotion. But what happens when kindness meets obsession? When love becomes possession? When suspicion transforms into deadly certainty? On October 11th, 2023, these three toxic ingredients combined in the most horrific way possible in a Miami Gardens library parking lot. A 64-year-old woman named Joyce Ann Small would commit an act so brutal, so calculated, that it would shatter not only her community's sense of safety, but everything we thought we knew about the thin line between love and hate. But what really happened that day will shock you, and the lesson it teaches might just save your life. Picture this. It's a warm October afternoon in Miami Gardens, Florida. Families are going about their daily routines, children are playing in parks, and at the North Dade Regional Library, people are quietly reading, studying, working on computers. It's the kind of peaceful, mundane scene that plays out in communities across America every single day. But hidden in the bushes near the library entrance, a woman waits. She's been there for hours, watching, calculating, her finger wrapped around the trigger of a .40 caliber Smith & Wesson handgun. This isn't a random act of violence by a stranger. This is something far more chilling. This is a woman about to execute someone she once called her best friend. The woman in the bushes is Joyce Ann Small. For years, she's been known in her community as someone who helps the homeless. She's opened her home to those who had nowhere else to go, fed people who were hungry, and given comfort to those who were lost. But today, all of that compassion has curdled into something unrecognizable. Her target, a vulnerable homeless woman named Sarai, who Joyce had taken in months earlier as an act of charity. The same woman who had shared Joyce's home, eaten at her table, and trusted her with her life. The same woman who Joyce now believed had committed the ultimate betrayal, sleeping with her married boyfriend. This case isn't just about murder. It's about the dangerous psychology of jealousy, the toxic dynamics of love triangles, and how the very act of helping someone can become the foundation for deadly obsession. It's about how isolation, mental health issues, and unresolved trauma can transform a person from a good Samaritan into a cold-blooded killer. If stories like this fascinate you, if you want to understand, not just what happened, but why it happened, and how we can prevent it from happening again, then hit that subscribe button right now. Because we don't just tell these stories for entertainment, we tell them to learn from them, to recognize the warning signs, and to understand the complex psychology that drives human behavior to its darkest extremes. Today, we're going to walk through every detail of this case. We're going to examine the forensic evidence, analyze the psychology, and uncover the life lessons that this tragedy teaches us. Because while we can't bring back the innocent life that was lost, we can honor her memory by learning from the circumstances that led to her death. This is the story of Joyce Ann Small, a woman whose act of kindness became the gateway to her own destruction, and whose jealousy would ultimately cost 2 lives, her victims, and her own. To understand how this tragedy unfolded, we need to understand the 3 people at the center of this deadly triangle, because this wasn't a random act of violence. This was the inevitable conclusion of a toxic relationship dynamic that had been building for months. Joyce Ann Small was 64 years old when she pulled that trigger. To her neighbors, she was known as a woman with a big heart and an open door. For years, she had made it her mission to help Miami's homeless population. She would invite people into her home, feed them, give them a place to sleep, and help them get back on their feet. But Joyce was a woman of contradictions. While she could show incredible kindness to strangers, those closest to her knew she had a darker side. She was intensely possessive, prone to jealousy, and capable of holding grudges that would fester for years. Her generosity often came with strings attached. She expected loyalty, devotion, and exclusive gratitude from those she helped. Joyce had never married, had no children, and had spent much of her adult life in relationships that left her feeling abandoned and betrayed. She had developed what psychologists call abandonment trauma, a deep-seated fear that everyone she loved would eventually leave her. This fear made her hyper-vigilant for signs of disloyalty, and it made her interpret innocent actions as deliberate betrayals. In her early 60s, Joyce had entered into a relationship with a married man. This relationship became the center of her world, but it also became the source of constant anxiety. She knew she was sharing him with his wife, but she had convinced herself that eventually he would leave his marriage for her. When that didn't happen, the frustration and jealousy began to consume her. Sarai was a woman whose life had been marked by struggle and vulnerability. She was homeless, living on the margins of society, moving from place to place, relying on the kindness of others to survive. She was soft-spoken, gentle, and grateful for any help she received. When Joyce first encountered Sarai, she was living on the streets of Miami Gardens. Joyce, in what seemed like a genuine act of compassion, invited Sarai into her home. For Sarai, this was a lifeline, a chance to get off the streets, to have a roof over her head, and to rebuild her life. But Sarai's vulnerability made her an easy target. She was dependent on Joyce's kindness, which gave Joyce power over her. She had no family to turn to, no financial resources, and no other place to go. This power imbalance would become crucial to understanding how the situation deteriorated so quickly. Those who knew Sarai described her as someone who was trying to better her situation despite overwhelming odds. She would spend time at the library, sometimes looking for work, sometimes just finding a quiet place to exist. She wasn't aggressive or confrontational, she was just trying to survive. The tragic irony is that Sarai's vulnerability, the very thing that made Joyce want to help her, is also what made her the perfect victim for Joyce's paranoid delusions. She couldn't fight back, couldn't defend herself effectively, and couldn't escape the toxic environment that Joyce's jealousy had created. The third person in this triangle was the married man, whose identity has been largely protected in court documents. But his role in this tragedy cannot be understated. He was the catalyst that transformed Joyce's generosity into deadly obsession. This man was living a double life. He was married, but he was also having an affair with Joyce. He would visit her regularly, spend time in her home, and give her just enough attention to keep her emotionally invested in their relationship. But he also maintained his marriage, which meant Joyce was always competing for his affection with someone else. The psychological impact of being the other woman cannot be understated. Joyce was constantly insecure about her place in his life. She never knew when he would choose his wife over her, and she lived in constant fear that he would end their relationship. This uncertainty made her hypersensitive to any perceived threats to their relationship. When Sarai moved into Joyce's home, she became an unwitting participant in this toxic dynamic. The married man would visit Joyce's house regularly, which meant he was also around Sarai. In Joyce's paranoid mind, this proximity became evidence of betrayal. The man's ambiguous behavior only fed Joyce's suspicions. He would sometimes be friendly with Sarai, sometimes ask about her, and sometimes seem to pay attention to her in ways that Joyce interpreted as romantic interest. Whether or not he was actually interested in Sarai is irrelevant. What matters is that Joyce believed he was. What we have here is a perfect storm of psychological dysfunction. Joyce's abandonment trauma made her prone to jealousy. Her relationship with a married man kept her in a constant state of insecurity. Her power over Sarai gave her someone to blame for her problem, and her isolation from healthy relationships meant she had no one to reality check her increasingly paranoid thoughts. This case teaches us that our greatest acts of kindness can become our most dangerous vulnerabilities if we don't guard our hearts and minds. Joyce's desire to help Sarai was genuine, but it was also complicated by her own psychological needs. She needed to feel important, to feel like she was the center of someone's world. When she began to suspect that Sarai was betraying her, sleeping with her boyfriend, undermining her relationship, taking advantage of her kindness, all of her generosity curdled into resentment. The same impulse that made her want to help Sarai also made her want to punish her when she felt betrayed. These three people, Joyce, Sarai, and the married man, were like chemical elements that, when combined, created an explosive reaction. Joyce's jealousy, Sarai's vulnerability, and the married man's divided loyalties created a situation where tragedy was almost inevitable. But the question remains, how did Joyce's suspicions escalate to murder? How did a woman who was once known for her kindness become capable of such calculated brutality? To understand that, we need to examine the foundation of betrayal that was built over months of mounting tension and escalating paranoia. The transformation from kindness to killer didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process, built on a foundation of suspicion, jealousy, and misinterpreted interactions. To understand how Joyce Ann Small became capable of murder, we need to examine the months leading up to October 11th. When Joyce first invited Sarai into her home, it seemed like a straightforward act of charity. Miami Gardens, like many American cities, has a significant homeless population, and Joyce had made it her personal mission to help where she could. She had helped homeless individuals before, offering them temporary shelter, meals, and assistance in getting back on their feet. But Joyce's kindness was complicated by her own psychological needs. She wasn't just helping people out of pure altruism, she was also feeding her own need to feel important, needed, and appreciated. When she helped someone, she expected gratitude, loyalty, and devotion in return. For Sarai, Joyce's offer was a godsend. She had been living on the streets, struggling to find safe places to sleep, searching for food, and trying to stay warm. Joyce's home offered not just physical shelter, but a sense of stability that Sarai hadn't experienced in years. Initially, the arrangement worked well. Sarai was grateful and respectful. She helped around the house, stayed out of Joyce's way, and seemed genuinely appreciative of the help she was receiving. Joyce felt good about herself. She was making a difference in someone's life, and she was getting the gratitude and admiration she craved. But this dynamic also created a power imbalance that would become crucial to understanding what happened next. Joyce held all the power in the relationship. She owned the home, controlled the resources, and could kick Sarai out at any time. Sarai, meanwhile, was completely dependent on Joyce's continued goodwill. The situation became complicated when Joyce's married boyfriend began visiting the house regularly. Suddenly, Sarai wasn't just a charity case. She was a witness to Joyce's most intimate relationship, and potentially a threat to it. Joyce's relationship with this married man was the most important thing in her life. She had invested years in this relationship, convinced herself that he would eventually leave his wife for her, and built her entire emotional world around their connection. The relationship was her primary source of happiness, but it was also her primary source of anxiety. Being the other woman is psychologically exhausting. Joyce was constantly competing with his wife for his attention, never knowing when he would choose his marriage over their affair. She lived in constant fear that he would end their relationship, and this fear made her hypersensitive to any perceived threats. When Sarai moved into the house, she became an unwitting participant in this toxic dynamic. The married man would visit Joyce's home regularly, which meant he was also around Sarai. He might make casual conversation with her, ask how she was doing, or simply acknowledge her presence in the house. In a healthy relationship, these interactions would be meaningless. But Joyce's relationship was not healthy. Her insecurity and jealousy made her interpret every interaction between her boyfriend and Sarai as potentially romantic or sexual. If he smiled at Sarai, Joyce saw it as flirtation. If he asked about Sarai's well-being, Joyce saw it as inappropriate interest. If he seemed comfortable around Sarai, Joyce saw it as evidence of attraction. The first signs of trouble appeared just a few weeks after Sarai moved in. Joyce began making comments about Sarai's behavior, suggesting that she was being ungrateful or disrespectful. She would complain that Sarai was taking advantage of her kindness, or that she was being too familiar with her boyfriend. Joyce's friends and neighbors began to notice changes in her behavior. She became more agitated when talking about Sarai, more paranoid about her boyfriend's activities, and more isolated from her social circle. She would spend hours analyzing every interaction, looking for signs of betrayal or disloyalty. The psychological term for what Joyce was experiencing is pathological jealousy, a condition where someone becomes obsessed with the idea that their partner is being unfaithful, even when there's no evidence to support this belief. People with pathological jealousy will interpret innocent interactions as evidence of infidelity, and they will become increasingly convinced of their partner's betrayal regardless of reality. For Joyce, every day brought new evidence of Sarai's betrayal. If Sarai was dressed nicely when the boyfriend visited, Joyce saw it as an attempt to seduce him. If Sarai was in the living room when he arrived, Joyce saw it as proof that she was trying to intercept him. If Sarai seemed happy or relaxed around him, Joyce saw it as evidence of intimacy. The tragic irony is that Sarai was probably just trying to be polite and friendly to someone who was important to her benefactor. She was living in Joyce's home, dependent on Joyce's kindness, and likely trying to maintain good relationships with everyone in Joyce's circle. But Joyce's paranoid mind interpreted these normal social interactions as evidence of romantic and sexual betrayal. As Joyce's suspicions grew, so did her surveillance of Sarai. She began monitoring Sarai's activities, checking her phone if she could, and interrogating her about her whereabouts when she left the house. She would ask probing questions about Sarai's interactions with her boyfriend, looking for inconsistencies or signs of deception. Joyce also began making accusations. She would confront Sarai about her behavior, accusing her of trying to steal her boyfriend, or of being ungrateful for the help she had received. These confrontations were often explosive, with Joyce becoming increasingly aggressive, and Sarai becoming increasingly defensive. The power dynamic in the house had completely shifted. What had started as a charitable arrangement had become a prison for Sarai. She was dependent on Joyce's continued goodwill, but Joyce was becoming increasingly hostile and paranoid. Sarai was trapped. She couldn't leave because she had nowhere else to go, but staying meant enduring Joyce's escalating abuse and paranoia. Joyce's obsession with her suspicions began to consume her entire life. She would spend hours analyzing every interaction, looking for hidden meanings in casual conversations, and building elaborate theories about Sarai's betrayal. She would lie awake at night, imagining scenarios where Sarai and her boyfriend were together, and she would work herself into a rage thinking about it. What do you think? Was Joyce's suspicion justified? Or was this all in her head? Based on everything we know about the case, there was never any evidence that Sarai was having an affair with Joyce's boyfriend. But for Joyce, the lack of evidence didn't matter. Her paranoid mind had created a reality where Sarai was the enemy, and that reality was more powerful than any facts. The foundation of betrayal had been laid. Joyce had convinced herself that Sarai was stealing her boyfriend, taking advantage of her kindness, and undermining her happiness. What started as an act of charity had become a deadly obsession, and Joyce was about to descend into a madness that would cost both women everything. The months leading up to October 11th, 2023, were marked by Joyce Ann Small's steady psychological deterioration. What began as suspicion had evolved into paranoid obsession, and what started as charitable kindness had transformed into controlling surveillance. The woman who had once been known for helping the homeless was becoming someone that even her neighbors barely recognized. By the summer of 2023, Joyce's behavior had become noticeably erratic. Neighbors who had known her for years began to comment on the changes they were witnessing. The woman who had once been friendly and outgoing had become withdrawn and suspicious. She would spend hours standing at her windows, watching the street, as if she were expecting someone to arrive or waiting for something to happen. Mrs. Rodriguez, who lived next door to Joyce, later told investigators that she had noticed Joyce pacing in her backyard late at night, sometimes talking to herself in an agitated manner. On several occasions she had heard raised voices coming from Joyce's house, Joyce's voice, high-pitched and angry, and another voice, softer and more defensive, that she assumed belonged to Sarai. The dynamic inside Joyce's house had become increasingly volatile. What had once been a sanctuary for Sarai had become a battlefield where every interaction was scrutinized, every word was analyzed, and every action was interpreted as potential evidence of betrayal. Joyce had developed what psychologists call hypervigilance, a state of constant alertness where she was always scanning for threats, always looking for signs of deception, always waiting for the next betrayal. She would interrogate Sarai about her activities, demanding to know where she had been, who she had talked to, and what she had been doing when Joyce wasn't around. The interrogations were relentless. Joyce would corner Sarai in the kitchen, the living room, or the bedroom, firing questions at her with the intensity of a prosecutor cross-examining a hostile witness. Where were you this afternoon? Why did you smile at him like that? What did you two talk about when I went to the bathroom? Are you trying to steal him from me? To understand Joyce's deteriorating mental state, we need to understand the psychology of pathological jealousy. Unlike normal jealousy, which is based on real threats or actual evidence of infidelity, Pathological jealousy is a delusional condition where the jealous person becomes convinced of their partner's unfaithfulness despite a complete lack of evidence. Joyce's jealousy was being fueled by several psychological factors. First, she had what psychologists call attachment trauma, a deep-seated fear of abandonment that stemmed from her childhood and early relationships. She had never learned to trust that people would stay in her life, so she was always looking for signs that they were preparing to leave. Second, Joyce was suffering from what's known as relationship insecurity, a condition where someone's self-worth becomes entirely dependent on their romantic relationship. Because Joyce had never married, had no children, and had few close friendships, her relationship with the married man had become the center of her identity. The thought of losing him was not just emotionally devastating, it was existentially threatening. Third, Joyce was experiencing what psychologists call cognitive distortion, a condition where someone's thinking becomes so distorted by their emotional state that they can no longer distinguish between reality and their fears. Every neutral interaction became evidence of betrayal, every coincidence became proof of conspiracy, and every kind gesture became a sign of romantic interest. The married man's behavior was only making things worse. His visits to Joyce's house were irregular and unpredictable. Sometimes he would stay for hours, sometimes he would leave quickly. Sometimes he would be affectionate and attentive, sometimes he would seem distant and distracted. This inconsistency was torture for Joyce, who needed constant reassurance that she was still important to him. The married man's ambiguous behavior towards Sarai was the gasoline that kept Joyce's jealousy burning. Because he was comfortable in Joyce's house, he would interact with Sarai in the casual way that people interact with their partner's housemates. He might ask her how she was doing, make small talk about the weather, or comment on something she was watching on television. In a healthy relationship, these interactions would be meaningless. But Joyce's relationship was not healthy, and her mind was not healthy. She would analyze every word, every gesture, every look that passed between her boyfriend and Sarai. She would create elaborate scenarios in her mind about what these interactions meant, and she would build complex theories about secret communications and hidden relationships. Joyce began to believe that her boyfriend and Sarai were communicating when she wasn't around. She would accuse Sarai of texting him, calling him, or meeting with him secretly. She would search through Sarai's belongings, looking for evidence of their affair. She would check her boyfriend's phone when he wasn't looking, searching for messages or calls from Sarai. The fact that Joyce never found any evidence of an affair didn't convince her that she was wrong. It convinced her that they were being more careful to hide their relationship. In her paranoid mind, the absence of evidence was evidence of a more sophisticated deception. Looking back, there were numerous warning signs that Joyce was becoming dangerous. Her friends and neighbors later reported that she had become increasingly agitated and paranoid in the months leading up to the murder. She would rant about Sarai's betrayal to anyone who would listen, and she would become angry when people suggested that she might be overreacting. Joyce's isolation was also becoming more pronounced. She had stopped participating in her usual social activities, had distanced herself from friends who questioned her suspicions, and had become entirely focused on the drama playing out in her own home. This isolation was dangerous because it meant she had no one to reality check her increasingly paranoid thoughts. Mental health professionals who have studied the case point out that Joyce was exhibiting classic signs of what's called delusional jealousy, a condition where someone becomes so convinced of their partner's infidelity that they lose touch with reality. People with delusional jealousy often become dangerous because they see their actions as justified responses to genuine threats. The community around Joyce failed to recognize the severity of her psychological deterioration. Her neighbors noticed that she seemed upset, but they assumed it was just a personal problem that would resolve itself. Her friends knew that she was having relationship difficulties, but they didn't realize that her thinking had become delusional. This case teaches us the critical importance of mental health awareness and community support systems. When someone we know is showing signs of psychological distress, we have a responsibility to take it seriously and to encourage them to seek help. Joyce's deteriorating mental state was visible to those around her, but no one intervened in a way that might have prevented the tragedy. By October 2023, Joyce's paranoid delusions had reached a dangerous crescendo. She had become convinced that Sarai was not just having an affair with her boyfriend, but that she was actively trying to destroy her life. In Joyce's mind, Sarai had transformed from a grateful charity case into a calculating enemy who was using Joyce's kindness against her. Joyce began to talk about teaching Sarai a lesson and making her pay for her betrayal. She would fantasize about confronting Sarai, about forcing her to admit her affair, about making her suffer the way that Joyce was suffering. These fantasies were becoming more detailed and more violent as Joyce's mental state deteriorated. The stage was set for tragedy. Joyce's mental health had deteriorated to the point where she could no longer distinguish between her paranoid delusions and reality. She had isolated herself from anyone who might have talked sense into her. She had convinced herself that Sarai was her enemy and that extreme action was justified. All that remained was the final trigger, the moment when Joyce would decide that her fantasies of revenge needed to become reality. That moment was coming soon, and when it arrived, it would transform a quiet October afternoon into a scene of horrific violence that would shock a community and cost 2 women everything they held dear. October 11th, 2023, started like any other day in Miami Gardens. The sun rose over the suburban landscape, casting long shadows across quiet streets where families were beginning their daily routines. Children were getting ready for school, adults were preparing for work, and the rhythm of ordinary life was playing out in thousands of homes across the city. But in Joyce Ann Small's house, the atmosphere was anything but ordinary. The 64-year-old woman who had once been known for her kindness and generosity was about to commit an act that would shatter her community's sense of safety and forever change the lives of everyone involved. Joyce woke up that morning with a sense of purpose that she hadn't felt in months. For weeks she had been consumed by paranoid thoughts about Sarai's betrayal, spending sleepless nights imagining scenarios where Sarai and her boyfriend were together, building elaborate theories about their secret affair, and working herself into a rage about their deception. But on this morning, something had shifted. Instead of the helpless fury that had been consuming her for months, Joyce felt a cold, calculating determination. She had made a decision during the night, and now she was going to act on it. Neighbors later reported that Joyce seemed unusually calm that morning. Mrs. Rodriguez, who lived next door, saw Joyce in her backyard around 7 a.m., standing perfectly still and staring at nothing in particular. When Miss Rodriguez waved, Joyce didn't respond. She seemed to be in a trance, lost in her own thoughts. Inside the house, Sarai was going about her normal morning routine, unaware that she was living the last day of her life. She had planned to visit the North Dade Regional Library that afternoon, as she did most days. The library had become her refuge, a quiet place where she could read, use the computers, and escape the increasingly tense atmosphere in Joyce's home. Joyce watched Sarai's preparations with the cold attention of a predator studying its prey. She noted what time Sarai left the house, which direction she walked, and how long it typically took her to reach the library. Joyce had been observing Sarai's routines for weeks, but now she was doing so with a specific purpose in mind. What happened next reveals the premeditated nature of Joyce's actions. This was not a crime of passion, it was a carefully planned execution. Sometime during the morning, Joyce retrieved her .40 caliber Smith & Wesson handgun from wherever she had been keeping it. She checked to make sure it was loaded, verified that the safety was off, and then she began to plan her attack. Joyce had chosen the library as her hunting ground for several reasons. First, it was a public space where Sarai felt safe and comfortable. Second, it was part of Sarai's regular routine, which meant Joyce could predict when she would be there. Third, the library's parking lot had areas of dense vegetation where Joyce could hide while waiting for her target. But perhaps most importantly, Joyce had chosen the library because it was symbolic. In her paranoid mind, the library represented Sarai's independence, her ability to go places without Joyce's permission, to have experiences that Joyce couldn't monitor, to potentially meet with people, like Joyce's boyfriend, without Joyce's knowledge. By attacking Sarai at the library, Joyce was not just committing murder, she was destroying the symbol of what she saw as Sarai's betrayal. The .40 caliber Smith & Wesson that Joyce chose for the murder was a powerful weapon, designed for maximum stopping power. This wasn't a small handgun that someone might carry for protection. This was a weapon designed to kill efficiently and definitively. Joyce's choice of weapon reveals something important about her mental state. She wasn't planning to threaten Sarai or to wound her as a warning. She was planning to kill her, and she wanted to make sure that when she pulled the trigger, Sarai would die. The forensic evidence later revealed that Joyce had spent considerable time preparing for the attack. She had practiced the route to the library, identified the best hiding spots, and planned her escape route. She had thought through every detail of the murder, from the moment she would position herself in the bushes to the moment she would fire the fatal shot. This level of planning contradicts any suggestion that Joyce's actions were impulsive or driven by a sudden burst of emotion. This was a calculated execution, planned and executed with military precision. The North Dade Regional Library had always been a place of learning and community gathering. Families brought their children there for story time, students came to study, and adults used the computers and research materials. It was a safe space, a place where people could come to better themselves and their communities. Joyce's decision to turn this sanctuary into a killing ground was particularly cruel. She knew that Sarai came to the library because it was one of the few places where she felt safe and welcome. By attacking her there, Joyce was not just taking Sarai's life, she was violating the safety and sanctity of a place that represented hope and improvement. The library's layout made it an ideal location for an ambush. The parking lot was surrounded by dense vegetation, providing multiple hiding spots for someone who wanted to remain unseen. The entrance was positioned so that anyone approaching the library would have walked past these hiding spots, making them vulnerable to attack. Joyce had studied the library's layout carefully. She knew exactly where to position herself to have the best view of the entrance, the best angle for shooting, and the best escape route after the murder. She had transformed a place of learning into a carefully planned killing field. While Joyce was planning murder, Sarai was simply trying to live her life. She had no idea that she was being watched, studied, and targeted for execution. She went about her morning routine with no sense of the danger that was approaching. Sarai's last day was marked by the same quiet dignity that had characterized her entire time in Joyce's home. Despite the increasingly hostile environment, despite Joyce's paranoid accusations and aggressive interrogations, Sarai had maintained her composure and her gratitude for the help she had received. Friends and acquaintances who saw Sarai that morning later reported that she seemed tired but hopeful. She was still trying to improve her situation, still looking for opportunities to build a better life, still believing that things would eventually work out. The tragic irony is that Sarai was completely innocent of the crimes that Joyce had accused her of. There was no affair with the married man, no conspiracy to steal Joyce's boyfriend, no calculated betrayal of Joyce's trust. Sarai was simply a vulnerable woman who had accepted help from someone she trusted and who was now going to die because of that trust. As the afternoon approached, both women were preparing for their final encounter. Joyce was checking her weapon, reviewing her plan, and steeling herself for murder. Sarai was getting ready for another ordinary afternoon at the library, unaware that she would never make it inside the building. The calm before the storm was about to end, and what would follow would be an explosion of violence that would echo through the Miami Gardens community for years to come. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the North Dade Regional Library parking lot, as Joyce Ann Small crouched in the dense bushes near the entrance. She had been there for over an hour, her .40 caliber Smith & Wesson handgun gripped tightly in her hands, her eyes fixed on the sidewalk where she knew Sarai would appear. This was the moment that months of paranoid delusions, sleepless nights, and calculated planning had been building toward. Joyce had convinced herself that this was justice, that Sarai deserved to die for her betrayal, that this execution was the only way to restore balance to Joyce's shattered world. At exactly 5:32 p.m., according to the library's surveillance cameras, Sarai appeared at the edge of the parking lot. She was walking at her usual pace, carrying a small bag, completely unaware that she was being watched by someone who intended to kill her. Joyce felt her heart pounding as she watched Sarai approach. This was it, the moment of truth, the moment when all of her rage and paranoia would finally be released. She raised the gun, steadied her aim, and waited for Sarai to come within range. Sarai was about 30 feet from the library entrance when Joyce emerged from the bushes. The surveillance footage captures the exact moment when Sarai realized she was in danger. Her body language changed instantly, from casual walking to frozen terror. "Joyce?" Sarai called out, her voice audible on the surveillance audio. "What are you doing here?" Joyce didn't answer immediately. She stood there, gun raised, staring at the woman she had once helped, the woman she now believed had betrayed her in the most fundamental way possible. "You know what you did," Joyce finally said, her voice cold and emotionless. "You know exactly what you did to me." What happened next was captured not only by the surveillance cameras, but by several bystanders who were in the parking lot at the time. Sarai, realizing that Joyce was holding a gun and that she was in mortal danger, began to beg for her life. "Joyce, please," Sarai pleaded, her hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "I don't know what you're talking about. Please, let's just talk about this." But Joyce was beyond talking. In her mind, Sarai's pleas were just more evidence of her deception. She had convinced herself that Sarai was a master manipulator, someone who had used her vulnerability to gain access to Joyce's home and then betrayed that trust in the most intimate way possible. "You're a liar," Joyce said, her gun still pointed at Sarai. "You're a liar and a whore, and you destroyed everything I cared about." Sarai began to cry, her tears streaming down her face as she continued to beg for her life. "Joyce, I never did anything to hurt you. I'm grateful for everything you've done for me. Please, just put the gun down and let's talk." At 5:35 p.m., Joyce fired the first shot. The .40 caliber bullet struck Sarai in the chest, sending her stumbling backward, but she didn't fall. She remained standing, her hand pressed to her chest, blood beginning to seep through her fingers. "Please," Sarai whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please don't do this." But Joyce wasn't finished. In her mind, this wasn't just about killing Sarai, it was about making her suffer, about making her pay for every moment of anguish that Joyce had experienced over the past months. What followed was not a mercy killing, but a systematic execution. Joyce fired 4 more shots in rapid succession, each one carefully aimed to cause maximum damage. The second shot hit Sarai in the abdomen, doubling her over in pain. The third shot hit her in the shoulder, spinning her around. The fourth shot hit her in the back as she tried to crawl away from her attacker. But it was the fifth shot that ended Sarai's life. As she lay on the ground, bleeding and barely conscious, Joyce walked over to her and fired one final shot directly into her head. The execution was complete. Sarai was dead, and Joyce had finally achieved the revenge she had been fantasizing about for months. The immediate aftermath of the shooting was chaos. Bystanders who had witnessed the murder were screaming. Some were calling 911, others were running away from the scene. The library parking lot, which had been a peaceful community space just minutes before, had been transformed into a crime scene. Joyce, meanwhile, seemed strangely calm. Witnesses later reported that she stood over Sarai's body for several moments, staring down at what she had done. Then, without any apparent emotion, she walked away from the scene, leaving the murder weapon behind. The 911 calls began pouring in at 5:37 p.m., just 2 minutes after the shooting began. "There's been a shooting at the library," one caller reported. "A woman just shot another woman. She's dead." "Oh my God, she's dead." Miami-Dade Fire Rescue arrived at the scene within minutes, but there was nothing they could do for Sarai. The medical examiner later determined that she had died from the gunshot wound to her head, though any one of the 5 shots could have been fatal. The forensic evidence at the scene painted a clear picture of what had happened. The pattern of bullet wounds on Sarai's body showed that she had been shot from multiple angles, indicating that Joyce had moved around during the attack to ensure that every shot hit its target. The positioning of the body and the blood spatter patterns confirmed that Sarai had been executed while she was on the ground, unable to defend herself. The final shot to her head had been fired from close range, indicating that Joyce had stood over her victim to deliver the coup de grace. The murder weapon was found near a walking trail close to the library, where Joyce had apparently discarded it after the shooting. Ballistics tests later confirmed that all 5 bullets had been fired from the same gun, and fingerprint analysis confirmed that Joyce had been the one who pulled the trigger. The shooting sent shockwaves through the Miami Gardens community. The library, which had always been considered a safe space, was now the site of a brutal murder. Parents began questioning whether it was safe to bring their children there, and many community members expressed fear about their own safety. Local news outlets descended on the scene, broadcasting live updates about the shooting and trying to piece together the story behind the murder. The contrast between Joyce's reputation as a helpful community member and the brutal nature of her crime became a central theme in the media coverage. If you're finding this case as shocking as I am, please hit that like button to help this video reach more people. Cases like this need to be discussed and understood, because understanding the psychology behind such crimes is the first step in preventing them. The murder of Sarai was not just a personal tragedy. It was a community tragedy that raised important questions about mental health, domestic violence, and the warning signs that people often ignore. In the next section, we'll examine how law enforcement responded to this crime and how Joyce's arrest and interrogation revealed the full extent of her psychological deterioration. The Miami-Dade Police Department's response to the library shooting was immediate and comprehensive. Within minutes of the first 911 call, patrol units were racing toward the North Dade Regional Library, their sirens cutting through the quiet suburban afternoon. Detective Maria Santos, a 20-year veteran of the force who specialized in homicide investigations, was among the first responders to arrive at the scene. What she found was a crime scene that was both shocking in its brutality and remarkably clear in its evidence. "I've seen a lot of crime scenes in my career," Detective Santos later testified, but the cold, calculated nature of this execution was particularly disturbing. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a planned assassination. The first priority was securing the scene and ensuring that there were no additional threats. Officers quickly established a perimeter around the library, evacuated any remaining civilians, and began the methodical process of collecting evidence. Multiple witnesses had seen the shooting, and their accounts were remarkably consistent. Joyce had emerged from the bushes, confronted Sarai, and then systematically executed her with multiple gunshots. The witnesses described Joyce as seeming calm and purposeful throughout the attack. Marcus Johnson, a library patron who had been walking to his car when the shooting began, provided one of the most detailed accounts. "I heard the woman, Sarai, begging for her life," he told investigators. "She was saying, 'Please, please, don't do this.' But the shooter just kept firing. It was like she was determined to kill her no matter what." Another witness, elderly library volunteer Dorothy Williams, captured part of the shooting on her cell phone. The footage, while shaky and brief, clearly showed Joyce standing over Sarai's body after the shooting, apparently checking to make sure she was dead. The investigation was greatly assisted by the library's comprehensive surveillance system. Multiple cameras had captured different angles of the shooting, providing investigators with a clear timeline of events and undeniable evidence of Joyce's guilt. The surveillance footage showed Joyce arriving at the library at approximately 4:20 p.m., more than an hour before the shooting. She could be seen walking around the parking lot, apparently scouting for the best position to launch her attack. At 4:45 p.m., she disappeared into the bushes where she would wait for Sarai to arrive. The cameras also captured Joyce's behavior after the shooting. Rather than fleeing immediately, she stood over Sarai's body for nearly a minute, seemingly ensuring that her victim was dead. Then she walked calmly away from the scene, showing no apparent emotion or urgency. The murder weapon was recovered approximately 30 minutes after the shooting. A police canine unit found the .40 caliber Smith & Wesson handgun on a walking trail about 200 yards from the library, where Joyce had apparently discarded it during her escape. Ballistics analysis confirmed that all 5 bullets recovered from Sarai's body had been fired from this weapon. Fingerprint analysis found Joyce's prints on the gun, the ammunition, and even on the spent shell casings that were scattered around the crime scene. With Joyce's identity confirmed through witness accounts and surveillance footage, law enforcement launched an immediate manhunt. Joyce's home was the first place they searched, but she was not there. Her car was found parked about half a mile from the library, suggesting that she had fled on foot after the shooting. The search expanded to include Joyce's known associates, friends, and family members. Police set up checkpoints around the Miami Gardens area and issued a BOLO "Be on the lookout" alert for Joyce throughout South Florida. Joyce Ann Small was arrested at 11:47 p.m. on October 11, 2023, less than 7 hours after she had committed murder. She was found sitting on a bench at a bus stop, approximately 3 miles from the library, staring blankly into the distance. Officer Robert Martinez, who made the arrest, later described the encounter. "She didn't resist or try to run. When I approached her and identified myself, she just looked up at me and said, 'I've been waiting for you.' It was like she expected to be caught. Joyce was taken into custody without incident and transported to the Miami-Dade Police Department for questioning. She was formally charged with first-degree murder, and additional charges were expected to follow. The interrogation of Joyce Ann Small began at 1:15 a.m. on October 12, 2023. Detective Santos and her partner, Detective James Rodriguez, conducted the interview in a small, windowless room at the police headquarters. What emerged during the interrogation was a chilling glimpse into the mind of a woman who had convinced herself that murder was justified. Joyce showed no remorse for her actions and seemed genuinely puzzled by the suggestion that she had done anything wrong. She Sajrai was a snake, Joyce told the detectives. She came into my home, ate my food, slept in my bed, and then she tried to steal my man. She got what she deserved. When Detective Santos asked Joyce to provide evidence of Sarai's affair with her boyfriend, Joyce's response was telling. I didn't need evidence. I knew what was happening. I could see it in their eyes, the way they looked at each other. A woman knows these things. After 3 hours of questioning, Joyce provided a full confession to the murder. She described in detail how she had planned the attack, how she had positioned herself in the bushes, and how she had systematically executed Sarai. I wanted her to know why she was dying, Joyce explained. I wanted her to understand that actions have consequences. She betrayed me, and betrayal deserves punishment. Joyce's confession was videotaped and would later become a key piece of evidence in her trial. The calm, matter-of-fact way she described the murder was particularly disturbing to investigators, who noted that she seemed to view the killing as a logical response to perceived betrayal. While Joyce was being interrogated, investigators were conducting a thorough search of her home. What they found provided additional insight into her deteriorating mental state and her obsession with Sarai. Joyce's bedroom contained a notebook filled with detailed observations about Sarai's behavior, including times when she left and returned to the house, descriptions of her interactions with the married boyfriend, and theories about their alleged affair. The notebook revealed the extent of Joyce's surveillance of Sarai. She had been documenting Sarai's activities for months, looking for patterns and evidence of betrayal. The entries became increasingly paranoid and hostile over time, culminating in explicit threats against Sarai's life. News of the arrest spread quickly through the Miami Gardens community and beyond. Local news outlets began running stories about the Good Samaritan turned killer, focusing on the apparent contradiction between Joyce's reputation as a helper of the homeless and her brutal crime. The story attracted national attention, with true crime podcasters and television shows picking up the case. The psychological aspects of the crime, the paranoid jealousy, the betrayal of trust, the calculated nature of the execution, made it a compelling story for audiences fascinated by criminal psychology. The arrest brought some relief to the Miami Gardens community, but it also raised troubling questions about how such a tragedy could have been prevented. Many people who had known Joyce expressed shock at her actions, saying they had never seen any signs that she was capable of violence. However, others began to speak up about warning signs they had noticed, but hadn't taken seriously. Neighbors reported that Joyce had seemed increasingly agitated and paranoid in recent months, and some said they had heard heated arguments coming from her home. Joyce's arrest marked the beginning of a complex legal process that would examine not only her guilt or innocence, but also the psychological factors that had driven her to commit such a brutal crime. The case would raise important questions about mental health, domestic violence, and the responsibility of communities to intervene when they notice signs of psychological distress. It would also provide a stark reminder of how quickly love can turn to hate, and how jealousy can transform a person from a helper into a killer. As Joyce sat in her jail cell, awaiting trial, the community she had once served was left to grapple with a fundamental question. How do you reconcile the woman who had helped the homeless with the woman who had executed one of them in cold blood? The answer to that question would come during the trial, where the full extent of Joyce's psychological deterioration would be revealed. To understand how Joyce Ann Small transformed from a charitable woman into a cold-blooded murderer, we need to examine the complex psychological factors that contributed to her violent actions. This case provides a chilling example of how mental health issues, when left untreated, can escalate into deadly violence. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a forensic psychologist who was consulted on the case, explained that Joyce's actions were the result of multiple psychological conditions working in combination. We're looking at someone who suffered from pathological jealousy, delusional thinking, and what appears to be a personality disorder that made her unable to maintain healthy relationships. Dr. Mitchell noted, Joyce's psychological profile revealed a woman who had struggled with abandonment issues throughout her life. Her childhood was marked by inconsistent caregiving, and her adult relationships had been characterized by a pattern of intense attachment, followed by feelings of betrayal and abandonment. The central psychological factor in Joyce's crime was pathological jealousy, a condition that goes far beyond normal relationship insecurity. People with pathological jealousy become obsessed with the idea that their partner is being unfaithful, even when there is no evidence to support this belief. Joyce's jealousy had several characteristics that made it particularly dangerous. First, it was based on delusional thinking rather than reality. Despite having no evidence that Sarai was having an affair with her boyfriend, Joyce had convinced herself that this affair was not only real, but was a deliberate attempt to destroy her life. Second, Joyce's jealousy was accompanied by what psychologists call cognitive distortion, a condition where someone's thinking becomes so distorted by their emotional state that they can no longer distinguish between their fears and reality. Every innocent interaction between Sarai and her boyfriend became proof of their affair in Joyce's mind. Third, Joyce's jealousy was fueled by her own insecurities and past traumas. Her fear of abandonment made her hypersensitive to any perceived threat to her relationship, and her history of failed relationships made her believe that betrayal was inevitable. Joyce's case demonstrates how delusional thinking can develop gradually and then suddenly escalate into violence. Her delusions about Sarai's betrayal didn't appear overnight. They developed over months of suspicious observation and paranoid interpretation. The process began with Joyce noticing innocent interactions between Sarai and her boyfriend. In a healthy mind, these interactions would have been forgotten or dismissed as meaningless. But Joyce's mind was not healthy, and she began to collect these interactions as evidence of a conspiracy against her. Over time, Joyce's interpretation of these interactions became increasingly elaborate and paranoid. She began to believe that Sarai was not just having an affair with her boyfriend, but was actively working to destroy her relationship and steal her happiness. The final stage of Joyce's delusional thinking was the belief that extreme action was justified. She convinced herself that Sarai deserved to die for her betrayal, and that murder was the only way to restore justice to her situation. Joyce's psychological deterioration was accelerated by her increasing isolation from friends and family. As her paranoid thoughts about Sarai intensified, she began to distance herself from people who might have challenged her delusions or encouraged her to seek help. This isolation was dangerous because it meant that Joyce's thinking was not being reality checked by others. In a healthy social environment, friends and family members would have pointed out that Joyce's suspicions were unfounded and would have encouraged her to seek professional help. But Joyce's isolation meant that she was living in an echo chamber of her own paranoid thoughts. Without external input to challenge her delusions, they grew stronger and more elaborate over time. Joyce's actions were also influenced by what psychologists call attachment trauma, deep-seated emotional wounds that result from early experiences of abandonment or inconsistent caregiving. Joyce's childhood was marked by instability and emotional neglect. Her parents were often absent, and she learned early that the people she loved could not be counted on to stay in her life. This childhood trauma created a deep-seated fear of abandonment that would influence all of her adult relationships. When Joyce took Sarai into her home, she was not just performing an act of charity, she was also trying to create the stable, loving relationship that she had never experienced in her childhood. Sarai's presence in her home gave Joyce a sense of being needed and important that she had never felt before. But Joyce's attachment trauma also made her hypersensitive to any signs of betrayal or abandonment. When she began to suspect that Sarai was having an affair with her boyfriend, it triggered all of her deepest fears about being left and betrayed. The married man's behavior played a crucial role in Joyce's psychological deterioration. His inconsistent attention and divided loyalties created a perfect storm for someone with Joyce's psychological vulnerabilities. Because the man was married, Joyce was always in a state of uncertainty about her place in his life. She never knew when he would choose his wife over her, and she lived in constant fear that he would end their relationship. This uncertainty was torture for someone with Joyce's abandonment issues. She needed constant reassurance that she was loved and valued, but the nature of their relationship meant that she could never get the security she craved. When Sarai moved into Joyce's home, she became a threat to the only source of love and validation that Joyce had. In Joyce's mind, Sarai was not just a potential rival, she was an existential threat to her emotional survival. Joyce's case also illustrates how societal factors can contribute to psychological deterioration and violence. As a woman in her 60s who had never married or had children, Joyce was already marginalized in many ways. The stigma associated with being the other woman in an extramarital affair added another layer of shame and isolation to Joyce's experience. She couldn't openly discuss her relationship problems with friends or family, which meant she had no outlet for her frustrations and fears. Joyce's economic situation also played a role. As someone living on a fixed income, she had limited resources to seek professional help for her psychological issues. The mental health services available to her were inadequate to address the complex nature of her problems. Perhaps most tragically, Joyce's case illustrates how our mental health and social support systems can fail people in crisis. Joyce's deteriorating psychological state was visible to those around her, but no one intervened in a way that might have prevented the tragedy. Her neighbors noticed that she seemed increasingly agitated and paranoid, but they assumed it was just a personal problem that would resolve itself. Her friends knew that she was having relationship difficulties, but they didn't realize that her thinking had become delusional. Even the healthcare system failed Joyce. She had made several visits to her primary care physician in the months leading up to the murder, complaining of anxiety and insomnia. But these symptoms were treated with medication rather than comprehensive mental health evaluation. From a psychological perspective, Sarai's vulnerability made her the perfect victim for Joyce's paranoid delusions. As a homeless woman who was dependent on Joyce's charity, Sarai was in no position to defend herself against Joyce's increasingly aggressive behavior. Sarai's vulnerability also made her an easy target for Joyce's projections. Because Sarai was dependent on Joyce's goodwill, Joyce was able to interpret Sarai's gratitude and attempts to please as evidence of deception and manipulation. The power imbalance between Joyce and Sarai meant that Sarai had no way to escape the toxic environment that Joyce's paranoia had created. She was trapped in a situation where her benefactor had become her tormentor and ultimately her executioner. This case teaches us that vulnerability is not just a social issue, it's also a psychological one. When someone is dependent on others for their basic needs, they become susceptible to the psychological problems of those who have power over them. The psychology behind Joyce's crime is complex and multifaceted. It involves pathological jealousy, delusional thinking, attachment trauma, and social isolation. But at its core, it's a story about what happens when mental health issues go untreated and when support systems fail to intervene. Understanding this psychology is crucial for preventing similar tragedies in the future. By recognizing the warning signs of psychological deterioration and by creating better support systems for people in crisis, we can work to ensure that cases like Joyce's never happen again. This tragic case of Joyce Ann Small and Sarai offers us profound lessons about human psychology, mental health, and the importance of community intervention. While we cannot undo the horror of what happened on that October afternoon, we can honor Sarai's memory by learning from the circumstances that led to her death and working to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Key Life Lesson 1: The danger of unchecked jealousy. Joyce's case provides a stark example of how jealousy, when left unchecked, can become a destructive force that consumes everything in its path. Normal jealousy is a common human emotion that most people experience at some point in their relationships. But pathological jealousy is something entirely different. It's a mental health condition that can lead to violence and even murder. The warning signs of pathological jealousy include obsessive suspicion without evidence, constant surveillance of a partner's activities, interpreting innocent interactions as evidence of betrayal, isolation from friends and family who question the suspicions, threats of violence against perceived rivals. If you recognize these signs in yourself or someone you care about, it's crucial to seek professional help immediately. Pathological jealousy rarely resolves on its own and often escalates over time. For those dealing with normal relationship jealousy, healthy coping strategies include communicating openly with your partner about your concerns, examining the evidence objectively rather than relying on assumptions, seeking support from trusted friends or family members, considering couples counseling if jealousy is affecting your relationship, practicing self-care, and building self-esteem outside of your relationship. Key life lesson 2. Mental health awareness and early intervention. Joyce's psychological deterioration didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process that was visible to those around her. Her neighbors noticed her increasingly agitated behavior. Her friends knew she was having relationship problems, and her healthcare provider was treating her for anxiety and insomnia. But despite these warning signs, no one intervened in a way that might have prevented the tragedy. This case illustrates the critical importance of mental health awareness and early intervention. Warning signs that someone may be experiencing a mental health crisis include dramatic changes in behavior or personality, increasing isolation from friends and family, paranoid or delusional thinking, threats of violence against themselves or others, inability to function in daily life, substance abuse or self-medication. If you notice these signs in someone you care about, don't ignore them. Approach the person with compassion and encourage them to seek professional help. If you believe someone is in immediate danger, don't hesitate to call emergency services. Key life lesson 3. Community responsibility and support systems. Joyce's isolation was a key factor in her psychological deterioration. As her paranoid thoughts about Sarah intensified, she distanced herself from people who might have challenged her delusions or encouraged her to seek help. This case reminds us that we all have a responsibility to look out for our neighbors, friends, and community members. When we notice signs of distress, we shouldn't assume that someone else will intervene. We should take action ourselves. Ways to support community members in crisis. Check in regularly with neighbors, especially those who live alone. Take notice of changes in behavior or appearance. Offer practical help like grocery shopping or transportation to appointments. Listen without judgment when someone shares their problems. Connect people with professional resources and support services. Don't ignore warning signs or assume they'll resolve on their own. Key life lesson 4. Healthy relationships and boundary setting. Joyce's relationship with the married man was inherently unhealthy and contributed to her psychological instability. Being the other woman in an extramarital affair created constant uncertainty and insecurity that fed her paranoid jealousy. This case teaches us about the importance of healthy relationship boundaries. Avoid relationships with people who are committed to others. Seek relationships that provide security and emotional stability. Recognize that you cannot change someone else's behavior. Don't sacrifice your mental health for a relationship. Seek professional help if you find yourself in toxic relationship patterns. For those who are married or in committed relationships, this case also highlights the importance of being honest about your feelings and needs, addressing relationship problems before they escalate, seeking couples counseling if you're considering an affair, ending relationships that are no longer working rather than betraying your partner's trust. Key life lesson 5. Protecting vulnerable populations. Sarai's vulnerability made her an easy target for Joyce's paranoid delusions. As a homeless woman who was dependent on Joyce's charity, she had no power to defend herself against Joyce's increasingly aggressive behavior. This case highlights our collective responsibility to protect vulnerable populations. Support organizations that provide services to homeless individuals. Advocate for policies that address homelessness and poverty. Recognize that vulnerability can make people targets for abuse. Create multiple sources of support for vulnerable individuals. Train service providers to recognize signs of abuse or exploitation. Based on the lessons from Joyce's case, here are concrete steps we can take to prevent similar tragedies. Individual level. Educate yourself about mental health warning signs. Develop healthy coping strategies for dealing with jealousy and relationship problems. Seek professional help if you're struggling with emotional or psychological issues. Build strong social support networks. Practice empathy and compassion toward others. Community level. Create mental health awareness programs in schools and workplaces. Establish support groups for people dealing with relationship issues. Train community members to recognize and respond to mental health crises. Provide resources and referrals for mental health services. Develop programs that support vulnerable populations, system level. Improve access to mental health services, especially for low-income individuals. Train healthcare providers to recognize signs of domestic violence and psychological abuse. Create protocols for intervening when someone is showing signs of dangerous behavior. Develop programs that address the root causes of homelessness and vulnerability. Implement policies that protect vulnerable individuals from exploitation. The murder of Sari had a profound impact on the Miami Gardens community. The library, which had always been considered a safe space, became the site of a memorial for Sari and a reminder of the tragedy that had occurred there. Community leaders used the case as a catalyst for important conversations about mental health, domestic violence, and the need for better support systems. New programs were established to provide mental health services to underserved populations, and community members were trained to recognize and respond to signs of psychological distress. The case also led to policy changes in how law enforcement and healthcare providers respond to reports of domestic violence and mental health crises. New protocols were established for assessing the risk of violence and providing appropriate interventions. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health issues, domestic violence or homelessness, help is available. National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, National Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800, National Alliance on Mental Illness. 1. Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Remember, seeking help is a sign of strength, not weakness. No one has to face these challenges alone. While Joyce's case is a tragedy that resulted in the loss of 2 lives, Sarai's death, and Joyce's destruction, it also provides us with an opportunity to learn and grow as a community. By understanding the psychological factors that led to this violence, we can work to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The key is not to turn away from difficult cases like this one, but to engage with them thoughtfully and compassionately. We need to have honest conversations about mental health, jealousy, vulnerability, and the responsibility we all have to look out for one another. Most importantly, we need to remember that behind every crime statistic is a human story, people who were loved, people who had dreams and hopes, people who deserved better than the circumstances that led to their destruction. By learning from Joyce's case and working to create better support systems for people in crisis, we can honor Sarai's memory and work toward a future where such tragedies are prevented rather than merely prosecuted. As we come to the end of this difficult but important story, we're left with a profound sense of tragedy and loss. 2 lives were destroyed on that October afternoon in Miami Gardens. Sarai, who died at the hands of someone she trusted, and Joyce, who threw away her life in a moment of paranoid rage. But this case is about more than just the loss of 2 individual lives. It's about the failure of systems, the breakdown of community support, and the devastating consequences of untreated mental health issues. It's about how jealousy can poison the human heart, how isolation can distort our thinking, and how vulnerability can make us targets for violence. The murder of Sarai sent shockwaves through the Miami Gardens community that are still being felt today. The library where she died has become a memorial to her memory, but it has also become a symbol of the work that still needs to be done to protect vulnerable members of our community. Joyce's case has been studied by psychologists, law enforcement officials, and community leaders who are working to understand how such tragedies can be prevented. Her story has become a cautionary tale about the importance of mental health awareness and the need for early intervention when someone is showing signs of psychological distress. But perhaps most importantly, this case has reminded us all of our responsibility to look out for one another. We cannot assume that someone else will intervene when we notice signs of trouble. We cannot ignore warning signs or hope that problems will resolve themselves. We must be willing to get involved, to reach out, and to take action when someone is in crisis. This case has taught us several crucial lessons that we must carry forward. First, jealousy is a dangerous emotion that can consume and destroy if left unchecked. We must learn to recognize the signs of pathological jealousy and seek help before it escalates to violence. Second, mental health issues are not personal failings. They are medical conditions that require treatment and support. We must work to eliminate the stigma around mental health and ensure that everyone has access to the care they need. Third, vulnerability is not a weakness. It's a human condition that requires our protection and support. We must create systems that protect vulnerable individuals from exploitation and abuse. Fourth, community support is essential for preventing tragedies like this one. We must be willing to get involved in the lives of our neighbors, friends, and community members, and we must be prepared to take action when someone is in crisis. Finally, we must remember that behind every crime statistic is a human story. People who were loved, people who had dreams and hopes, people who deserved better than the circumstances that led to their destruction. This story is not just about what happened in the past. It's about what we can do in the future to prevent similar tragedies. We can all play a role in creating safer, more supportive communities where people like Joyce get the help they need before their problems escalate to violence, and where vulnerable individuals like Sarah are protected from harm. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health issues, please reach out for help. If you notice signs of distress in a neighbor, friend, or community member, don't ignore them. If you see someone being abused or exploited, take action. We all have the power to make a difference in someone's life. We all have the responsibility to look out for one another, and we all have the opportunity to learn from tragedies like this one and work to prevent them from happening again. Thank you for staying with me through this difficult but important story. Cases like Joyce's are never easy to discuss, but they are essential for understanding the complex factors that can lead to violence and for developing strategies to prevent such tragedies. If you found this analysis helpful, please subscribe to our channel and share this video with others who might benefit from these insights. The more people who understand the warning signs of psychological distress and the importance of community intervention, the more lives we can potentially save. Remember, we're all responsible for looking out for each other. Mental health matters, community support matters, and every life has value. By working together, we can create a world where tragedies like this become increasingly rare. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health issues, domestic violence, or homelessness, please reach out for help. There are resources available, and you don't have to face these challenges alone. Thank you for watching, and remember, we're all in this together.